I'm really delighted to see you all here for this discussion on accelerating the coal to clean transition. Just to remind ourselves, if there's any need to, why are we here to discuss this morning? Well, it's because it's one of the most important things we need to do, but also one of the most challenging. We all know that accelerating the transition is crucial for sustainable development, for avoiding the worst impacts of climate change. But it's really challenging as well because it involves rewiring of economies and societies. And that's been challenging in advanced economies with relatively flat demand for energy, like mine, the UK, likely to be even more challenging in countries like Indonesia, where the demand for energy is growing fast and where there are relatively young coal power plants. So that's why the government of Indonesia and France set up the Coal Transition Commission to find solutions for these challenges. And I'm really delighted that we're able to start off today with some opening remarks from Farah Heliantina, the Assistant Deputy for the Acceleration of the Energy Transition. Unfortunately, Ibu Farah can't be here in person, but she's going to join us on the screen.
Good morning, everyone, and warm greeting from Indonesia. Distinguished delegates, colleagues, and partners, thank you for joining us today at Belém. I'm honored to open this session with our friends from Climate Ambassador for France, Mr. Benoit Fraraco, as co-chair of Coal Transition Commission, or CTC, and Julia, head of PPCA Secretariat. Through the CTC, we are turning global commitment into real action that take place in power plant, investment decision, and our commitment. Indonesia and France co-lead the CTC with strong and complementary roles. Indonesia shares real experience as a country that still relies on coal, yet is determined to move forward toward clean energy. France contributes deep expertise in clean power system and financing. This shows that North-South cooperation can truly work in a practical and equitable way. Indonesia has set a clear direction for our power sector. Power sector emission to peak before 2035, net zero emission by 2060 or earlier, a $21.4 billion GHP partners policy reform. Indonesia is advancing a coal retirement pilot under the ADB with careful assessment on its technical, financial, and social aspects. Countries that remain reliant on coal, including Indonesia, can begin to transition with practical, credible, and scalable steps. Coal flexibility is an important bridge in this journey. It reduces emission while keeping the light on. It gives more space for renewable energy without risking system stability. But flexibility must be time-bound. Every hour of reduced coal operation must lead to more clean energy in the system. Today, we are proud to launch two key CTC reports. The first is From Flex to Phase Out, and the second about growing the pipeline of coal to clean projects. There are toolkits for implementation for government, utilities, and investors to use right now. Going forward, the CTC will help countries to scale financing. MDBs, private investors, and philanthropy must move quicker. Strengthen capacity for faster and better decision-making. Accelerate project pipelines, especially for coal retirement and repurposing. As we gather here at COP30, it's time to move from discussion to action. Indonesia invites all partners to align policy, finance, and technology behind one mission: reducing emission rapidly and fairly. Indonesia and France will continue to lead the CTC as convener, catalyst, and collaborator. Together, let us make this transition happen faster, fairer, and for everyone. Thank you.
Faster, fairer, and for everyone. That really encapsulates the goals of the Coal Transition Commission. And as Ibu Farah told us, today the Coal Transition Commission is launching 2 reports setting out how we think we can do that. And we're now going to tell you a little bit about these reports and what's in them. And you can find on your seats as well a QR code to get to the reports. So, as we've already explained to everyone, the Coal Transition Commission brings together governments and finance and technical bodies to try and find solutions to some of the challenges of a coal transition. In our first year, we worked with the IEA to put together a roadmap for the transition from coal to clean, and we also put together some suggestions on the key policies which were necessary to enable the transition, as well as what needed to be done to scale financing for the transition. This year, we've been digging in more to implementation and looking at the steps that we really need to be taking to build a pipeline of coal to clean projects and to look at how we can support the faster integration of renewables. So let's start with the first report, growing the pipeline of coal to clean projects. The background to this report is in the IEA modelling, they identified the early retirement of coal power plants and the replacement with clean as being the primary lever for reducing emissions from coal power. And over the past 2 years, we've seen a number of pilot projects, innovative solutions emerging in this space. But we're not yet delivering these projects at the scale we need to be doing. So in this report, what we wanted to do is to take the learnings from these pilot projects, to set them out and to set out some recommendations for how we could start to scale the pipeline. So in the report, we set out first of all what we've learned about the key enabling conditions at a country level for enabling projects to go ahead. And we point there to the importance of a clear policy direction for the transition plans, no new coal commitments, but also to ability to provide replacement sources of energy, so a readiness in the grid and in the system to be able to scale up replacement sources of energy. We then set out some of the solutions that have been emerging, so re-leveraging, transition credits, securitization, and we look at the ways in which these solutions might apply in different contexts, looking in particular at the age of a coal power plant and the type of market that they're operating in. Then on the basis of this, we did an analysis of quite a large section of the global coal fleet to see which ones we thought there were solutions which were available that would work for them. So you can see here the key results. We grouped the coal power plants that we looked at into 3 buckets. So those where we think there are solutions available at the moment which could work for them, and they're coloured in orange on this map. Those where we think that at the country, at the system level, the enabling conditions are in place, but there's not yet solutions which might be available to finance the transition. And those are in dark blue on the map. And then finally, those plants which are in place where we think that the enabling conditions are not yet in place, and that's the ones in light blue on the map. So a brief kind of overview of the findings. We found that around a third of the fleets of power plants that we looked at, it looks like the existing solutions would work for them. And so that's primarily independent power producers, often in deregulated markets, where we find a lot of these plants where it looks like the solutions can work. In the second bucket of places where there are enabling conditions, but not yet we see kind of clear solutions, are primarily vertically integrated utilities who often face considerable debt constraints, and also older plants. So while it can be challenging to retire young plants, for older plants it can be challenging as well to find a financial model that works, given there is less scope for re-leveraging and less scope to try and monetize some of the reduced emissions. Then in the last category are plants where we think the enabling conditions at a system level aren't yet necessarily in place. And those are in places which are perhaps very heavily coal dependent and where there are challenges in finding good replacements to coal. So for example, integrated heating and coal plants. So that's the overall kind of conclusions of the analysis. We then set out some recommendations. So the first recommendation is obviously we should be looking to scale where there are solutions available. And we make some suggestions about how to do this, obviously raising awareness, but also simplifying, having kind of clearer standards, and perhaps some element of bundling could help here. The second recommendation is that we should all lean in to really prove out emerging solutions. For example, high integrity coal to clean transition credits. It would be great to kind of really demonstrate that this is a solution that can work and to have a first pilot and have it scaled up. The third recommendation is around working to develop solutions for the areas where we're not so sure that they exist yet. So what could we do for vertically integrated utilities, for example? Transition credits might be one option, but perhaps also there are things like off-balance solutions with special purpose vehicles or other ways of trying to address the debt constraints that they have. And then finally, obviously, we're also saying that we all really need to really lean in to support countries where the enabling conditions aren't yet in place to develop those enabling conditions. And now, on to the second report. This is the From Flex to Phase Out report. So the background to this report is in the roadmap last year, the IEA identified flex as a secondary lever which could be used to reduce emissions from coal power plants, especially in emerging economies. So we thought we should pick up and look a bit more deeply into where flex could be useful. Why might flex be useful? So I think the story here is as countries shift to integrate more variable renewables into their grids, there are sometimes challenges around balancing the system, matching supply and demand, and flexibility becomes increasingly important. In the long term, it's likely that cleaner sources of flexibility, so for example, batteries, grid interconnection, matching supply and demand, are likely to be the most reliable, the most cost-effective, and clearly the least emitting sources of flexibility. But there are many places in the world where these don't yet exist or don't exist at the scale which are needed. And in those circumstances, we suggest that there might be a role for coal flexibility to accelerate the integration of renewables. But there are clearly challenges with coal flexibility and risks. So first of all, there are some costs sometimes involved with coal flexibility, not only to make technical changes to enable the plants to operate more flexibly, but also to exit long-term power purchase agreements or to vary the terms of power purchase agreements. And financing these costs can be quite difficult because people rightly worry about how can they guarantee the emissions reduction from flexible operation. Isn't there a risk that by investing in a coal power plant, we inadvertently extend its life? So this report also sets out guardrails for how you might use this as a policy within a broader program of trying to accelerate the coal to clean transition. And those, again, are primarily about having roadmaps, having clear incentives to operate less, and also clear timelines and reporting. So here, too, we finish with a few recommendations, which are primarily focused on encouraging governments to ensure that their energy markets support all forms of flexibility. So in some countries, it's very difficult to incentivize any kind of flexibility because of long-term contracts, power purchase agreements, take-or-pay agreements. And so there are some changes which are, you might say, no regrets, which will incentivize all forms of flexibility. We're then encouraging people to make sure that any use of coal flexibility is built into a longer-term coal-to-clean transition plan, and to be really careful about where you're focusing this tool. So that was a bit of a whistle-stop tour of these two reports. I hope you've been able to take away some of the key conclusions from that, and I do encourage you to read them all, ask us any questions about them, tell us how we can improve this work and make it more useful for you. Another really important piece of work which has been done in this space this year is by the JETP Secretariat in Indonesia, and they have been looking at captive coal and what are the options for replacing captive coal in Indonesia. And so I'm now going to invite Paul Buta-Buta, the head of the JETP Secretariat, to come and explain some of the findings from this work.
Thank you, Julia. Yeah, as Julia mentioned, that we have done a kind of study related to the captive. This became important actually because the fact is that when we start with the JETP, we focus only on grid. At that time, we don't have any data about captive. So now we are trying to see what is actually the captive situation in Indonesia. We find out that now operating captive power, we have almost 26 giga. Almost 20 giga is actually coal power plant. And then when we look at the captive that we have now, additional 5 gigawatt is now under construction. And then there is a permitted captive for about 5.7 giga, and there are still some let's say, pre-permit that's still in the pipeline. So it could be the case actually that in total by 2030 we would have about 35 to 40 giga of captive power plant. But the good thing is for captive in Indonesia is that by regulation we said that 10 years after the operation, each captive has to reduce their emission by 35%, and by 2050, all captive has to be shut down. So that's by regulation. So we try to check what is the option available for us when we are trying to, let's say, decarbonize the captive power. We run 6 scenarios, starting with trying to do industrial clustering. So a lot of, let's say, captive power actually operate individually. So would it be possible, for example, to cluster them so that there will be a kind of, let's say, efficiency if we can have that together, managed together. And then we also run scenario with, let's say, doing energy efficiency or a process switching. Also trying to see whether it's possible actually to do, to connect them to the grid. And also whether it is possible to run or develop on-site renewable energy, fuel switching to coal or ammonia, and the last is actually whether it is possible to also invest in carbon capture and storage. This is what we have seen based on our model that we have developed, that, for example, the only possible best option for us is actually if we could develop let's say, renewable on the side. So CCU is almost impossible. There is possibility for industrial clustering and also better improvement in the energy consumption. That's also could be done through the let's say, energy efficiency. And we have seen that in the area where the captive are operating, we have this potential renewable more than let's say around 800 gigawatt potential available for the if we want to change them to renewable. And then when we try to check on the emissions, we see here actually by 2050, as said, that the emission in the baseline scenario, it will be zero because all the captive will have to be shut down. But we could start already reducing the emissions by integrating to the grid, doing industrial clustering and so on. That's the scenario that we have developed. But what we also need to look at is actually the cost. In running the scenario, we have to see that actually we need at least investment of 6 billion until 2030. This is about 70% higher than in the baseline scenario. Then we will need around 2 billion annually over 2030 to 2040 so that we could really decarbonize the captive power plant in Indonesia. So our report, we put actually more detailed information in our report. It is available in our website. If you want to check the report, please download it in our jetp/id.org. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pakbul, for that super interesting presentation. So now we've bombarded you with lots and lots of facts, figures, and information. Let's try and take some time to digest it slightly. And we're really delighted that we have a super panel here to talk about some of the issues. So I'm going to invite Axel Priambodo from the Coordinating Ministry of Economic Affairs in Indonesia to take the stage and to introduce us to our panelists.
Check. Yes, thank you very much, Julia, and thank you very much for all the speakers. So good morning, everyone, and welcome again to the Indonesian Pavilion. My name is Axel Priambodo. I'm a senior policy analyst from the Energy Transition Acceleration Unit from the Coordinating Ministry for Economic Affairs. And today, as already mentioned by the previous speakers, we are discussing one of the toughest challenges in the clean energy transition. Entitled How to Retire or Repurpose Coal Plants in a Way That is Reliable, Affordable, and also politically survivable. So it's a very light topic for a Tuesday morning. But luckily we have an outstanding panelist that will deep dive into more details on that topic. So first, we are going to invite our first panelist, from South Africa's Presidential Climate Commission, Mr. Devon Pillay, Executive Manager for Institutional Support. So Devon works at the center of South Africa's JETP, navigating governance, finance, community issues, and yes, ESCOM. So glad to have you here. And the second panelist we have, that is someone investors listen to very carefully. Ms. Anjali Viswamohanon, Policy Director at the Asia Investor Group on Climate Change. So she understands what makes billions of dollars says yes or no to transition projects. Welcome, Anjali. And the third panelist, we have the Director General of Singapore's National Climate Change Secretariat and a member of the UNFCCC Article 6.4 Supervisory Board. Please welcome Benedict Chia. So Ben is leading Singapore's work on transition credits, carbon markets, and regional climate cooperation. And unfortunately, Gaia from Australia unable to join us today due to other commitments, which is great news for the panelists. So you have relatively a bit more time for you to express your messages to everyone here. So first, I would like to start with South Africa. It's about institutional and implementation enablers. So first, Devon, I want to ask, so South Africa's JETP is among the most advanced globally. So from your experience, what is the single biggest enabler needed to move from planning to real project implementation?
Thanks, Axel, and good morning to you. Good morning to the panelists and to the audience. So the Just Energy Transition Investment Plan of South Africa estimated that we would require around 1.4 billion US dollars for the energy transition. So the JETP commitments and pledges to date is around 15 billion US dollars. Interestingly, in terms of climate finance flows in South Africa, between the periods 2017 to 2019, we had $62 billion climate finance flows. For 2018 and 19, and 20, we've had 130 billion US dollars flows, and 21-22 period, we've had 188 billion US dollars flow into us climate finance. Of the last report, of the 188, 80% of that capital was raised domestically. So it was roping in the private sector, crowding in private sector and both public sector. Private sector obviously played a much larger role. And of the 188 billion, 155 billion or so went towards mitigation issues, which speaks to the shift towards renewable energy. Now, I mean, just within that indication, you would find that the Jet P flows is just a fraction of the total flows that have emerged. And within the period of 2013 to 2025, South Africa has put onto the grid around 16 gigawatts of renewable energy. In 2011, the Renewable Energy Investment Independent Power Producer Procurement Program, which was a renewable plan for the period, estimated will put in 17,800 megawatts on the grid. So we've surpassed that, right? So we've surpassed that. What's interesting, though, is that JETP played that catalytic role to mobilize finance. So the critical point is mobilizing finance is paramount, central, core to implementation. And what I'm speaking through is what we've got planned to exceed current targets. So recently, many of you may be aware that South Africa released its IRP, which targets 79 gigawatts of energy, renewable energy by 2042. So in terms of realizing these projects, there's just two key things that needs to happen. Is addressing the finance gaps, which is around 100 billion per year. And second is addressing some of the policy and regulatory matters and to unlock these opportunities. So as part of the climate finance, it is very critical that you begin to capacitate at the local government level, you begin to capacitate policymakers and regulatory regulators within government to become flexible, understand global best practice, and start to implement this so we're able to get more onto the grid.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Devon. It's good to see and hear the institutional and political commitment from the country. And also now, from someone that the investors really listen to. So, Gaia, from the investors' standpoint, what characteristic makes coal transition projects truly investable? Whether retirement, repurposing, or flexibility?
Maybe I can just start with sort of giving a brief of the work that we do at AIGCC and how we sort of come about to this phase of investing in coal-fired retirement as well. But just wanted to start with appreciating the opportunity to be here this morning. I think the reports that were launched by PPCA, but also Pak Paul's report on the captive coal is going to be tremendously useful in the work that we do. So really appreciate all the work that's going on. But at AIGCC, what we try and do is we bring together institutional investors that have exposure to Asian markets. So we work with over 80 plus institutional investors that manage around 35 trillion USD in AUM. The work that we have done with them over time is to enable them to embed climate risks and opportunities in the investment decisions that they make in Asian markets. Just to sort of throw some numbers at you as well. So 93% of the investors that we work with have made commitments on fossil fuel policies, which means that they will reduce their investment exposure to fossil fuels going forward. And this is sort of like full commitments for most investors. Out of these 93%, around 21% are also committing to invest and support managed coal phase out, recognizing that it's a real risk in Asian markets that needs to be tackled if we want to sort of achieve net zero globally. And this has been with the work that we have done with investors over time to sort of really get them to understand how would transition need to work and what's the real role of capital to be able to support that. So what we have an interested group of investors that are understanding what the needs of transition is specifically in emerging markets and willing to engage. To support... Hello? Hello, can you hear me? Should I try a different mic? Hello, can you? Yeah. So, I mean, I think to support investors in actually translating some of these commitments into implementation, we have engagement programs with the highest emitting corporates in Asian markets. One such program is the Asia Utilities Engagement Program. So we enable investors to engage with the highest emitting utilities across Asia, engaging with them on their transition plans, their net zero commitments, but also sort of going beyond their day-to-day planning to actually board oversight to ensure that climate risks is being factored in at the highest level in terms of management of these utilities, so that these utilities are able to sort of clearly set ambitious targets supported by short-term, mid-term, long-term transition plans that's supported by capital allocation, and investors can actually feed into that process through capital to support those outcomes. So we engage with several markets that's sort of covered in the report, especially in ASEAN. And maybe just to add to this element of transition, we've also been enabling investors to understand the just transition element, both at the facility or at the asset level in terms of frameworks that can be used to sort of hold entities and assets more accountable. But I think one step above that with all of the JETP conversations is I think investors really need to understand what does just transition mean quite systemically from a place-based context. What is the opportunities and risks in that market? So we just came out with a report earlier this year to sort of really deep dive into what place-based transition really means and how can investors actually input capital to support the systemic just transition in markets like Indonesia, Malaysia, India, and others. And one additional element, when we sort of come to the question that you had asked me, right, like what do investors really need to see in terms of investable managed coal phase out? You have to sort of look at the financial considerations, you have to look at the technical considerations and the regulatory considerations that would sort of enable that pipeline to sort of continuously flow and see those outcomes in the market. To enable companies to think a bit more seriously on the financial considerations, what we've also come out, we will be releasing a report next week that sort of really looks at how Asian markets, as you know, are exposed to climate hazards quite a bit. So what we did is we did a financial assessment to understand how much climate hazards would impact 2,500 assets in Asia. And what we found was actually really stark. We're seeing, I think, around 6.5 billion of losses already that will sort of surmount in terms of the balance sheets of utility companies if they don't have resilience plans in place. And most utilities that we analyzed, which is around 11 utilities in Asia, they don't have resilience plans in place. And these losses will increase to 33% if these risks are not considered enough. And we are seeing particularly for Asia, it's the heat stress and the precipitation related risks that will manifest a lot more. And particularly for coal-fired power plants that are located in vulnerable regions like the coastal areas. So I think this would also add an additional facet for companies to actually think about the economic viability of coal-fired power plants and think about whether it makes sense to phase it out earlier. So we're also sort of thinking about multiple ways to get companies to think about financial planning and see how coal phase out can be made economically viable considering multiple pathways.
Yeah. Check. Yeah. Thank you very much, Anjali. So from your perspective, we can now see that investors, they're not afraid of risk, but they really hope that we can reduce uncertainty. By reducing uncertainty, it can really make it more attractive for investors to step in. And thank you very much for giving a good segue for the next question, where we want to see another financing tools that can help unlock capital. So move over to you, Ben. So from Singapore perspective, so Singapore has been exploring transition credits and mechanism like FAST-P. So what enabling conditions must be in place for countries to implement transition credits effectively? And how can these tools support coal transition pipelines across the region?
So first, thanks so much for the invitation to sit on this panel itself. So transition credits play an important part. And in terms of the enabling conditions, I think we see three broad enabling conditions that needs to be met in order for transition credits to be viable. The first one is, I think, what has been picked up in the presentation slides already, that you need power sector decarbonization plan itself, a transition plan for the power sector, and that's critical because you need to be able to get a sense of where exactly does the specific project on coal phase out sit within this broader decarbonization plan of the sector. So that's key, and it's important because it provides certainty and it provides assurance on additionality. I think one of the key concerns about which we have heard about early coal phase out is that you phase out one plant, the excess demand just goes to another coal-fired power station that then ramps up capacity. So that assurance on how the power sector is going to transform is quite important, which is why I think in the earlier presentation where we talk about Indonesia's plans to decarbonize the power sector, I think that sets a very important backdrop as to what's needed. The second enabling condition, and I think, Axel, it's what you talked about at the start, is that it must be politically survivable. I would pitch it more broadly to say that the coal transition must have broad public support. And I think one of the key concerns is that if you look not just at the coal station itself, but the entire value chain, coal-related jobs actually account for millions of jobs in Asia itself. So if you want transition credits to work, there needs to be a credible transition plan for the workers that will be affected. We need to identify viable job opportunities in adjacent sectors that they can transition to and that they can maintain, if not enhance, their livelihood options. So the just transition element is key. The third enabling condition, I would say, is that given that coal transition is not easy, there are many challenges along the way. We would definitely want to unlock as much value from the transition credits as possible. And for this to happen, I think what's needed is a robust national framework on Article 6 transactions itself, because then that allows the transition credits that are generated to be used for international compliance. And I think Indonesia recently passed a presidential decree that gave a lot more certainty in terms of their pathway towards Article 6 itself. So for us, I think those three conditions are absolutely important: power sector decarbonization, just transition plan, and a national framework on Article 6 transactions for transition credits. Thanks.
Yes, thank you very much, Ben, for the message that transition credit is a solution as long as the requirements and the conditions are fulfilled. And hand it over back to Anjali. So we are going to deep dive a little bit more into regional perspective, in this case, Southeast Asia. So from an investor standpoint, what forms of regional cooperation, whether ASEAN, trilateral platforms, or cross-border financing, could unlock capital and accelerate scalable coal transition solutions?
I think as AIGCC, the ASEAN bloc, I think, is a really important one, where there's sort of scores of opportunity if you actually sort of are able to cooperate across borders. I think there's already several fantastic initiatives that we're seeing through ASEAN, but also individual country leadership to actually bring in more capital into the market to enable energy transition. We are also seeing bilateral cooperation between countries like Australia, ASEAN, the UK, ASEAN, and others to actually help these markets actually position themselves better to be able to attract capital to support renewable energy build out. I think one recent conversation that we've been a part of that we think is very promising for ASEAN's future on renewable energy build out, but also coal transition, is on the ASEAN power grid. I think there's a huge possibility there to sort of unite the region in terms of thinking about a regional decarbonization supported by an ASEAN power grid. And there's a huge amount of investor interest in sort of seeing what types of finance can come in to support those models. In fact, we are in sort of several discussions within sort of the ASEAN forum to sort of think about structures to enable capital to come in. Not just from a finance perspective, but also looking at technical ways of structuring to enable that to happen. I think there's also in terms of trade and opportunity in terms of manufacturing to support the renewable energy deployment, which I think is quite crucial to actually embed the coal phase out discussions more seriously in ASEAN, because ASEAN is a region where the power demand forecast growth is actually quite a lot. So you need to think about balancing that with renewable energy deployment and then think about coal phase out. So I think the renewable energy conversation, supporting that through regional cooperation on trade, manufacturing, and sort of presenting that as an opportunity set to investors is quite crucial. And we're seeing very encouraging conversations on that across trade discussions, but also economic cooperation across multiple departments that we've been a part of. I think just in terms of numbers, I think if there is more structured cooperation on the economic viability of renewable energy, I think you're looking at a $5 trillion opportunity for ASEAN with sort of 66,000 jobs that could be created if that cooperation sort of really comes through. And I think all of these sort of different facets, I think, are quite interesting for investors, especially considering the fact that many of the international investors, their exposure to emerging markets is actually quite minimal. If you're able to actually bring more understanding of the needs of the market through more regional coordination, like the ASEAN framework, that could actually serve to attract more capital into the market. And we're trying to do a lot on these specific efforts.
Perfect. Thank you very much. A very good forecast and how we see a good potential if the regional consistency remain kept, and that can really lower the investors' risk. And now coming back again to the more on the asset level perspective. So back to you again, Ben. So about flexibility. So what pathway do you see for financing for coal flexibility projects in the near future, especially from the perspective of market mechanism or system planning?
Thanks so much for the question. So the importance of coal flexibility, I think, was highlighted in the presentation just now, which we wholeheartedly agree with. The only thing I'd say is that if you look at some of the coal projects, the early coal retirement projects in Asia that are being tested, they're being tested on a project level approach. So this is the Vera methodology VM52 that was approved earlier this year. For coal flexibility itself, that specific project level methodology is not able to accommodate coal flexibility. I know there are efforts in the pipeline to add modules to the methodology to be able to capture more different pathways towards early coal retirement, which are currently not being captured. But I'd say the most viable option right now is what's called the jurisdictional or sectorial approach towards crediting. And that's currently being trialed in various other countries outside Asia itself. I know the Dominican Republic is actively looking at it as a possibility. And the jurisdictional approach basically enables more options for you to credit compared to a project level approach. There are pros and cons of both approaches. A jurisdictional approach is harder to implement, but once you implement it, it has more flexibility. Project level approach is relatively easier to implement, but there are a bit more constraints in terms of what you can credit for. But under jurisdictional approach, what it requires a certain country to do is to set a clear sectorial decarbonization plan for the power sector and establish what the baseline is, and then any efforts that takes you below the baseline can actually be credited. So it gives flexibility not just to the coal flex option that you talked about, but other things like captive coal plants. It also gives flexibility to maybe even addressing coal projects in the pipeline that are removing from the pipeline itself. So planned projects that never materialize itself. So I'd say that's one feasible pathway. If a country is able to implement it, I think has a clear milestone towards coal flex itself. But yet at the same time, if we are able to enhance the current project level methodology, add in additional modules, that's also another pathway. But my sense is that the second approach probably still requires a little bit more work and might take a little bit more time before we are able to realize that from happening. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ben. So yeah, flexibility financing is a key enabler for many transitional projects. And now we want to see on the implementation aspects on South Africa. So Devon, so South Africa's JETP has been closely watched worldwide. So what key lesson or positive or cautionary should other countries consider when designing financing packages or country platform for financing?
Yeah, thanks, Axel. I think, that's an interesting question, right? So as you move from a JETP to country platforms, you have deeply invested within this process the issues of developmental objectives. But let me pause and just take a step back, right? So South Africa is dealing with two issues on its energy front. One is the shift away from fossil fuel towards renewable energy. The second is addressing and securing its energy needs. So for a few years, we've been experiencing severe energy shortage, commonly known as load shedding. We've also experienced, as a result of load shedding, a constraint to economic growth. And to address these issues, we've got this concurrent function of expanding renewable energy, getting it onto the grid to bring in some security and to contribute towards the GDP, address issues of unemployment, poverty, etc. The second is how do we deal with the closure of our power stations without compromising energy security. So there is a plan in place that's decommissioning as well as repurposing the power stations. And as we do that, it becomes a very interesting ecosystem because our coal belt is linked to our energy generation, which is the Mpumalanga region of South Africa. And if you shut down power stations within a very short period of time, without having alternative economic opportunities, you're going to completely devastate that particular region. So it's very important that as you plan this, you've got to sequence it and basically choreograph the closure of the power stations in order to ensure you have a just transition. And as part of the just transition, as I mentioned, is economic diversification, identifying new industrial opportunities, upskilling and reskilling workers that have lost their jobs, as well as workers that have been unemployed for many years. So the JETP, plays that very catalytic role that I've mentioned. So you get different packages that's been offered from grant funding to highly concessional loans, to debt. Now, I think the one key learning for us as the PCC, and this is in retrospect, is that the grant funding, which is around $500 million, was largely within the control of the ambits of funders. So they decided what projects and initiatives to fund with the grants. What we are seeing is, in the lack of a proper coordination around grant funding, you end up with an oversupply in certain activities. So at one point, because there was a huge uptake in renewable energy, there was a demand for skilled RE installers. And most funders then zoomed into training and upskilling for installers. And over a period of time, within 6 months, we had an oversupply. Similarly, you had the issue of the deeply embedding procedural justice, and in many cases, this was interpreted as just consultation. But procedural justice is much deeper. It's engaging with communities, engaging with workers to co-create and have a positive outcome. What you would find is a lot of funding went into consultations, which is a once-off engagement, either with workers and communities, and no follow through. So you ended up with an oversupply of consultations to the point where communities openly expressed frustration at these engagements. So when it comes to grant funding, I think we need to be very clear in terms of what is to be funded, quantify the funding so that you achieve an outcome. Similarly, a lot of grant funding went into research, and what you found is a number of different research institutions undertook research in a very particular area, so you had an oversupply of data in those areas, while there was a huge demand in other areas that were not addressed. So for me, grant funding needs to be very carefully managed. The second is, as I've mentioned in our climate finance landscape report, we had 188 billion, 80% of that was domestic funding that was deployed. In the JETP, you have something in the region of 5.5 billion US dollars for concessional loans, around 2 billion for highly concessional loans. Both of those, including commercial debt, which is around, I think, around 5 billion as well. There's been very little traction in that. And what we've picked is the conditions that come with those grants, the requirements that comes with the grant, don't meet or don't match local needs. So while there is a pipeline of projects that needs to be developed, the grant funding as well as the concessional loans and the loans don't necessarily feed into demands on the ground. So there needs to be some sort of sequencing, some sort of alignment between the loan, the loan packages and what's feasible on the ground. So many of the funders argue that the funding opportunities are too small, so they want large packages. And large packages can only be taken up by large companies. And for large companies to enter an area, you have to have a massive industrialization project on the ground. And in the absence of that, you find that JETP funding doesn't necessarily flow. So there needs to be a sequencing between your industrial policy, your economic diversification, as well as then linking that with the right platforms. So the PCC is currently developing something called the Just Transition Finance Mechanism, which would then provide that linkage between JETP funding as well as other funding that's going to be crowded in towards realizing just transition projects and energy generation initiatives on the ground. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much, Devin. So I really, really get the point on the importance of cost neutrality and also reliability, neutrality in terms of for us transitioning. And also very good and very happy for you to also touch upon how we can strategically manage the finance mobilization. And also, it's also a good segue for our next question on how we can see in more detail on the private financing. So over to you, Anjali, about the international alignment for private investment. So investors rely heavily on credible standards, guarantees, and policy consistency. So what kind of international cooperation or alignment, for example, through NDBs, G20, GFANs, or CTC, would help scale private investment into coal transitions?
I mean, I think what we've been sort of advocating for in a majority of our conversations on coal phase out is sort of like a clear commitment at the national level in terms of a climate outcome. I think in Asian markets, when we've sort of did an analysis of like where the development policies and the climate policies are, it's sort of quite separate. We need to sort of see this come together in sort of a clear objective on how economic outcomes, social outcomes, and climate outcomes actually come together in terms of a plan. So I think countries are at a really interesting phase right now where you're setting NDCs through this process. And then how does that translate into a clear energy target that sort of is supported by sectoral plans that gives companies a clear indication of what sort of public incentives, policy support they can expect in terms of setting an ambitious transition pathway that would incorporate components of power sector sort of diversification in terms of coal phase out, looking at renewable energy integration, what sort of support can you expect in terms of grid build out plans that would sort of be supportive to that can be supported again by investment. I think this level of detail is quite important to investors. I think amongst many of the ASEAN markets that we are engaging with, we are at that stage where there is a clear national level energy target, but how does that sort of really translate into sectoral plans for how utility sector can feed into that? I think from a policy perspective, when you look at, especially because a lot of Asian markets have vertically integrated utilities, which would really need a regulatory framework to support their transition and look at incentives that could be linked to emissions or climate-related objectives beyond performance as well, I think is quite important. Looking at how subsidies play a key role in these markets in terms of artificially bringing down the price of fossil fuels and instead sort of using some of those subsidies to enable that transition that could attract capital flows into these markets are quite important. And we're seeing tremendous sort of, announcements through forums like G20 and the others for the need to sort of actually bring more transparency, accountability into things like fossil fuel subsidies and how can you actually enable sustainable finance flows to support ambitious renewable energy targets. Looking at coal phase out, I think is quite important. The conversations on just transition, I think, has been especially stark over the last few years. I think it's equally important to understand what is not working in terms of just transition, learn from those lessons so we can actually successfully embed that into funding conversations going forward. Because I think if there's anything that we learn from the lessons in other markets, it's that just transition needs to be quite front and center to ensure the success of what we're trying to do in markets. And I think fundamentally we're at a really good stage, I think, because we're seeing so many types of transitions happening in multiple markets that there are multiple models that we can actually examine to see what works and what doesn't. Not that you can just sort of copy paste sort of different mechanisms in every market, but at least there's sort of like lessons that you're able to learn and translate that into implementation. And I think even for the element of coal flexibility, I think it's becoming inevitable that in the planning for ASEAN markets that you have to sort of look at embedding an element of coal flexibility and how do you enable finance flows to support that becomes a very important conversation. And when you sort of look at frameworks like taxonomies, the national energy transition plans that has a financing element, seeing how these sort of frameworks could enable finance flows to support those outcomes is equally as important. But also ensuring that frameworks builds in more credibility on which types of plans need to be flexible for how long. Building more credibility on the environment, social outcomes is quite important to enable finance flows. So I think just to sort of come back to the point that you were sort of trying to ask, I think a lot of the coordination that's happening at international levels to sort of bring lessons, case studies from other markets, I think is very important to help countries set more ambitious policies that could attract capital, and that's what investors are fundamentally looking for.
Yeah, thank you very much. So yeah, those are the requirements for us to unlock more private capitals. So yeah, please do take note, and also for me, governments, and that is very interesting. Thank you very much. And also coming back to regional perspective from Singapore. So from a country perspective, from ASEAN countries. So given ASEAN's strong economic and political interconnections, so among us ASEAN countries, so what opportunities do you see for regional leadership to unlock finance and support scalable coal transition solutions?
I'd say within ASEAN itself, there's significant opportunity to demonstrate that this is feasible and to build a key pipeline itself. As you have seen in the slides just now, there's a significant proportion of coal plants in ASEAN that could possibly be suitable for early coal retirement itself. And I think it's a demonstrative effect, not just of transition credits, but the use of concessionary financing, blended finance solutions to be able to phase out coal. I think that's a big opportunity for ASEAN. But I'd say the benefit of ASEAN is not just only what each ASEAN country does alone within its own national boundaries, but also how ASEAN as a whole, I think as mentioned, can come together to develop an ASEAN power grid. An ASEAN power grid has been spoken about for a very long time, more than a few decades. But I think we are now at the cusp whereby there seems to be a lot more concerted effort to move in this direction. In fact, recently, the Asia Development Bank and the World Bank, together with the Asia Center for Energy, has put together an ASEAN Power Grid financing facility that is in excess of 10 billion US dollars itself. So it does show that there is the economic case and a political will to make something happen. And just to contextualize, an ASEAN Power Grid is important to help drive early coal phase out, because the replacement, which is renewables, tends to be intermittent. And if ASEAN can come together to lean and leverage on each other to better manage this intermittent resource itself, I think it creates more pathways, more opportunities for us to phase coal out of the system itself. Thanks.
Yes, yeah, thank you very much, Ben. So, in summary, thank you very much to all the panelists that we have here, and give a round of applause for everyone. So what we heard today is very clear that the solutions do exist. Okay, everyone. So coal to clean transition require flexibility financing, credible crediting mechanism, regional cooperation, strong governance and long-term partnership, and also trust. So our challenge is now to scale them and to implement them. So with that, thank you very much, and I will hand it over to Julia, but please to all the panelists to remain on stage. We're going to hear the closing remarks, and then we're going to have a family photo after this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to all our panelists. What a great discussion. I feel like I've taken away kind of 100 ideas for where we should be focusing next year, and many things which we haven't yet thought of. So thank you so much. And we're really pleased that to conclude our event today, we have Selina Catalano-Grenet from the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Director for Global Affairs. So as we said at the start of the event, France has been the co-chair of the Coal Transition Commission along with Indonesia. And great to hear your perspective to bring us to a close today.
Dear colleagues, bom dia. I would like to thank you very much for giving France the opportunity to deliver the closing remarks for this important event and on this very important topic. It has now been 2 years since the Coal Transition Accelerator was launched by President Macron at COP28. I'm proud to see that this process now is bearing fruit with the publication of the Commission 2 reports. Those 2 reports, they offer concrete, actionable guidance to help us move from principles to implementation in accelerating the transition from coal to clean energy. I wish to thank Indonesia for its leadership on this issue, and I would like to thank Julia and her team for their tireless work in advancing this agenda. The science is unequivocal. Coal must be phased out in the next decade if we are to keep the temperature goals of the Paris Agreement within reach. Accelerating the shift from coal to clean energy is not only essential for reducing emissions, it's also key to unlocking sustainable economic development, strengthening energy security, and avoiding the most severe climate impacts. So we know that this transition is particularly challenging in emerging economies, where coal plants are very often, they are young, where electricity demand is rising rapidly, and entire communities depend on coal-related activities. Energy systems are complex, are widely different from one country to another, and there is no one-size-fits-all solution. Such a task cannot be addressed in isolation. It requires deep international cooperation. And this is why France has engaged in several just energy transition partnerships, notably with Indonesia, but also with South Africa, where in Indonesia, we will invest 500 million euros to support the shift towards cleaner and more resilient energy systems with concrete projects already underway. It's also why President Macron launched the Coal Transition Accelerator at COP28 which is operated by PPCA and which is guided by the principles of the Pact for People, Prosperity and the Planet. And those principles are based on the conviction that no country should have to choose between eradicating poverty and addressing climate change. For the last 2 years, the CTA task has been to identify practical pathways that reconcile energy transition, economic growth, and social justice. The reports published today address central challenges of the coal to clean transition. First, while countries should prioritize early retirement of coal-fired power plants, repurposing existing assets to operate more flexibly can play a meaningful role in the near term, particularly in emerging countries, provided that the relevant guardrails are in place. Second, the implementation gap can be reduced by developing robust, bankable pipelines of coal transition projects. This requires identifying the right regions and appropriate assets, fostering innovation, designing solutions that reflect the diverse challenges faced by coal-dependent economies. It also requires building the institutional and regulatory frameworks, foundations that enable credible long-term investment. And finally, we must work collectively to scale up volume of finance dedicated to coal transitions. Public budgets alone will not be enough. We know that. And we need to mobilize innovative instruments to attract private capital. This is what you have talked about today, including de-risking tools, blended finance approaches, and mechanisms that reward credible transition pathways. France will continue to champion this agenda within the Coal Transition Commission and in all different settings. And we stand ready to support governments, utilities, and partners that are prepared to seize this opportunity demonstrated in this report. I call on all relevant stakeholders to join this effort, and together we can take the priority steps needed to implement the Commission's recommendations, starting with commitments to no new coal and to build and finance a new generation of projects. Our responsibility is really to demonstrate that despite the magnitude of the challenge, pathways to success exist. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, everyone. We've really been grateful to have you here. Do read the report and come again to our next event.